Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming out on this not so beautiful day to this beautiful space here at the Toledo Museum of Art. My name is Anna Marley. I am the Director of Curatorial Affairs here at the Toledo Museum of Art. And on behalf of our institution, I'm pleased to welcome you here to celebrate Return to Turtle Island. And while I welcome you in my official capacity, I would like to say just a brief word, very much from a personal perspective. I am a Canadian and American citizen. And the objects we are going to be discussing today hail from Turtle Island, which is an Indigenous name for the land that we stand on that we now call our own, either the United States or Canada. And this exhibition is so important because it explores these amazing 18th century objects that were brought to Scotland by Scottish military leaders in the late 18th century and then have returned to the United States. Many of these objects were made in what is now called Canada, along the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Seaways. I am from Montreal originally. Originally, our dear Canadian friends were supposed to be with us here in Toledo. Unfortunately, current political events have made that impossible, which to me as a Canadian and American gives me great pain. So that's why I tell you, I am saying this from a personal perspective, not an institutional perspective. But I think this is important for us to keep in mind because as we study the 18th century and look at the past and look at how these objects ended up in Scotland, why they ended up in Scotland, who they were created by, and how they came back, this gives us a great opportunity to think about history, about borders, about nations, and about peoples. So I really thank you all for coming today. I know you are going to really love the talk and the exhibition. And I would like to invite my colleague Willow up to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
All right, hello everyone. Would like to offer an additional welcome to our scholarly roundtable discussion for our ongoing exhibition, Return to Turtle Island, Indigenous Nation Building in the 18th Century. This exhibition is made possible with the generous support of presenting sponsors Susan and Tom Palmer, season sponsors Taylor Automotive Family and the Rita Barber Kern Foundation, platinum sponsor AGC of Northwest Ohio, and additional funding from the Ohio Arts Council, which receives support from the state of Ohio and the National Endowment for the Arts. My name is Willow Gritzmaker, and I'm the Curatorial Research Associate of American Art here at TMA. Our event will be following a hybrid format for the aforementioned reasons, but following the discussion between our scholars, we will have some time for audience Q&A, and we invite you all to participate. Likewise, afterwards, we invite you all to stay around for some refreshments, as well as to take the time to visit the exhibition if you have not had a chance to already. That will be back across the street. Before the event gets further underway, we would like to share our land acknowledgement. The Toledo Museum of Art is located on homelands of the Erie, Kickapoo, Odawa, and Seneca. We recognize that many other tribes and nations have also conducted trade on and called this region their home, including the Lenape, Miamia, Ojibwe, Peoria, Potawatomi, Sauk, Shawnee, and Wyandot. As a cultural institution, it is our responsibility to understand and continually share knowledge about the complicated history of colonialism in the space we occupy, the peoples who were here before us, and the enduring presence, resistance, and diversity of Indigenous peoples in our region. In keeping with the museum's vision of creating a culture of belonging, we commit to building meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities and working to dismantle the systemic invisibility of Indigenous peoples. It is our hope that events such as this one will allow us to further pursue these stated aims. Leading our conversation today is one of the primary people we should likely all be thanking for making all of this possible, Dr. Joanna Minnick, our consulting curator of Native American art and the curator behind Return to Turtle Island. And I will now be handing the mic over to her.
Thank you, Willow and Anna, for setting the stage. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I wanted to thank personally the participants that are here physically, but also those who are here virtually. We obviously have had to pivot somewhat and be creative in a kind of rapid response to world events. And so Henrietta and Christian asked me last night over dinner what I hoped our audience would gain from attending today. And I really think what it comes down to is an appreciation of just how special this collection of objects really is, how it has served so well in its role as ambassador, because 250 years later, these objects are still drawing people in, engaging us in conversations, and making us see the world in a very different way. So, you know, I would thank our ambassador objects as well. I wanted to introduce briefly our speakers in the order that they will speak so that I don't have to break up the sort of flow of the presentation. It is going to be somewhat formal, informal, hybrid. We're going to reserve questions for the end so we can kind of keep that flow going. And then, of course, you're welcome to stay for the reception, too. We have, to the best of our ability, prepared what we hope is going to be a really engaging discussion among scholars in the field, but also allow for this kind of audience participation. So I am happy to say that I am the least important person on this panel today, and I'm going to introduce all of our panelists. The accolades are extensive and impressive, and so I just wanted you to appreciate how many A-listers in the field we have in our presence. So Ruth Phillips is Professor of Art History Emerita at Carleton University in Ottawa, where she held a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Art and Culture from 2003 to 2017. She was, with University Museum and Indigenous community-based colleagues, the founder of the Great Lakes Research Alliance, which created a shared database and other programs that encourage culturally appropriate knowledge sharing about these arts, and they are an entity that we've worked very closely with. Her books include Trading Identities, The Souvenir in Native American Arts from the Northeast, Museum Places Toward the Indigenization of Canadian Museums, and with Janet Catherine Burlow, Native North American Art, which was the standard when I was in school myself. So I have been a fangirl of Ruth's for decades. Henrietta Lici is Executive Director of the Wheelwright Museum, to my right. Prior to this, she worked at the National Museum of World Cultures in the Netherlands, the National Museum Scotland, and Department of Ethnography in the British Museum. She has had fellowships at Humboldt University Berlin, is member of the Research Center for Material Culture in the Netherlands, and holds an honorary professorship in the School of Social and Political Science at the University of Edinburgh, Scotland. Her research work is the field of Native American art and material culture, as well as critical museology, visual anthropology, military history, and the history of collections. Annette DeStecher is an American art scholar. She teaches in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Colorado in Boulder. Her teaching and research focus on histories and integrated visual art across culture and politics of representation, with a special interest in women's history and critical museology. Her recent book, Wendat Women's Art, University Press of McGill, Queens, brings together a full history of the art forms of the Wendat First Nation of Quebec and challenges the historical anonymity of Indigenous women artists. Christiane Crouch is Dean of Graduate Studies, Professor of Historical Studies and American and Indigenous Studies, and Director at the Center for Indigenous Studies at Bard College. She is the author of the award-winning Nobility Lost and has published articles in journals such as Early American Studies, William and Mary Quarterly, and Panorama. She also works as a curatorial advisor in contemporary Indigenous art and writes art criticism with essays in Beyond the Horizon, Making American Artists, and Jeffrey Gibson, The Space in Which to Place Me. Her current book project, Queen Victoria's Captives, A Story of Ambition, Empire, and a Stolen Ethiopian Prince, explores the human and material consequences of the 1868 Magdala Campaign, and she is an elected fellow of the American Antiquarian Society. Way more ambitious people than I am. And then we have Dr. Alan Corbiere, who is an Anishinaabe from Michnik First Nation. His research is focused on Anishinaabe language revitalization, narrative, material culture, and history. He has recorded elders in his own community and is investigating ways to disseminate that knowledge in a more effective manner. He's an assistant professor in the history department at York University and holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in the Indigenous history of North America. So as you can tell from these introductions, the panel we have here today is truly international. It represents the very best of what can happen when we collaborate with scholars from across borders, across disciplines, and across communities. So if our virtual participants have their cameras on, I can't see the screen, then we are ready to roll. So Ruth, I wanted to let you start with your vital role in the development of the Great Lakes Research Alliance as an entity, but also this fascinating ongoing work that you're doing with the collecting practices of the 18th century. So we'll start with you.
Thank you, Joanna, very much. And thank you to the Toledo Museum of Art, which I've had the great pleasure of visiting in the past and wish I were there with you today. But I hope what we will be presenting will increase your ability to enjoy this wonderful collection that's been acquired. It's a real pleasure to join you in celebrating this acquisition and the return to Turtle Island of the Farquharson collection. My first contact with this collection occurred 35 years ago. Please first slide, please. I learned of it through Dale Idians, curator of ethnology at the National Museum of Scotland, who came across it when she visited Invercargill Castle while on holiday in the Scottish Highlands. She and I were tremendously excited to learn of a collection that had remained intact in the same place to which it had been sent more than 250 years earlier. By the late 20th century, virtually all such surviving collections had been broken up and integrated into public and private collections in ways that made it very difficult or impossible to identify their histories and places of origin. Dale and I wrote an article together in which we endeavored to identify the probable provenances of many of these beautifully preserved items. Thanks to 18th century correspondence preserved by the Farquharson family and comparison with related 18th century collections. What was missing from that initial research was the critically important dimension of Indigenous knowledge and perspectives. A decade after Dale and I published our article, I had the privilege of joining with a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous specialists to found the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Cultures, or GlasSalon. Next slide, please. Our purpose was to develop new understandings of Great Lakes cultural heritage preserved in museums, archives, and other repositories by creating broader access and pooling different knowledges, Indigenous, scholarly, museum-based, while respecting Indigenous authority and protocols of privacy. Next slide, please. Our initial focus was on material culture and art, but as the project grew, it expanded to include language and other aspects of expressive culture in order to create as holistic a research approach as possible. Our primary tool has been the creation of a shared database, the GlasSalon Knowledge Sharing Platform, or GKS, next slide, which currently hosts digital records of 5,000 Great Lakes heritage items and 17,000 Anishinaabe and Cayuga words. You can learn more about it and access its database online at glasac.org. We are thrilled to welcome the Toledo Museum of Art as a new GlasSalon partner. Much of what I have to say this afternoon about the Farquharson collection has been enriched by the transformative opportunity of learning from my fellow GlasSalon researchers, a number of whom are present on this panel. Next slide. The title of my talk, The Cult of Curiosity and the Culture of Diplomacy, is a good example. For while the European cult of curiosity and its importance during the 17th and 18th centuries has been the subject of research for many years, the equally important Indigenous culture of diplomacy has become clearer to Western researchers more recently, primarily through the influential work of Indigenous knowledge holders and scholars. Both paradigms emerged during the first century of contact, but were systematized and elaborated during the 1700s through the expanded processes of trade, gifting, commissioning, and commodification that accompanied the European competition for political dominion and colonization in eastern North America. Slide, please. The transatlantic traffic in things was further accelerated by the almost continuous warfare of the long 18th century, especially the three wars that followed each other in quick succession between the 1750s and 1815, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolution, and the War of 1812. During these wars, military success depended on alliances with indigenous peoples. Officers and colonial officials engaged in treating with indigenous leaders, organized councils conducted according to indigenous protocols and rituals, and these negotiations unfolded over days and weeks, marked by rich visual and material presentations. Next slide. Gift giving was a formal component of these negotiations, while, as we will see, a lively trade in curiosities was carried on more informally in the background. It is important to remember that indigenous people too actively collected during the 18th century. Next slide. Through formal gift exchanges, indigenous leaders acquired pipe tomahawks, chief's medals, laced hats, linen shirts, stroud coats, and woven belts of wampum commissioned of indigenous women by Europeans. On their own account, indigenous women sold moccasins, woven sashes, and other beautifully made items in order to purchase things they wanted: guns, knives, tea, pottery, cloth, glass beads, silver ornaments, and other European manufactures. Although we have far less direct evidence of indigenous peoples' responses to European material culture and art, the indirect evidence of the materials and European artifacts they incorporated into their dress and daily life testifies to indigenous aesthetic responses, tastes, and careful discriminations of quality. Next slide. Let me bring these, sorry, that's Wilkie, my dog. Let me bring these generalizations down to earth by describing the collecting activities of two young soldiers who fought in the American and British armies during the American Revolution, Captain Joseph Bloomfield and Lieutenant John Caldwell. Both men took advantage of their military service in frontier regions to collect finely crafted garments, wampums, and ornaments. Their activities illustrate particularly well the impurity of the paradigms of curiosity and diplomatic gifting, which, though identifiable as distinct practices, more often overlapped and intertwined. I begin with Joseph Bloomfield, son of a prominent New Jersey family whose sympathies with the American patriots led him to join the Continental Army as soon as war broke out in 1776. As a captain in the 3rd New Jersey Regiment, he was sent to the Mohawk Valley on what was then the New York frontier, the same region Lieutenant Farquharson had traveled through 18 years earlier. For the first 2 years of the war, Bloomfield kept a diary whose daily entries are unusually rich with detailed descriptions of the lifestyles and appearance of the indigenous people who so clearly fascinated him: their dress, demeanor, food, music, languages, and much else. Bloomfield soon accompanied officers sent into Indian Territory to negotiate alliances with the Mohawk and Oneida nations, who had become firmly allied to the British through the skilled work of the recently deceased Indian agent, Sir William Johnson. Next slide. Attending the council, Bloomfield was struck by what we might today think of as the warriors' body language of sovereignty. They, quote, "set in their Indian painted warlike dress, with their Indian tomahawks with pipes, the handle of the tomahawk being the tube and the head of the hatchet the bowl, and smoking with such a confident air of dignity and superiority as if they were above all other beings made, and their authority extended over the whole earth," unquote. As the negotiations proceeded, he further noted, quote, "My curiosity induced me to pay a visit alone this morning to Johnson Hall." Slide, please. There, Lady Johnson, the late Indian agent's daughter-in-law, showed me Sir William Johnson's picture, which was curiously surrounded with all kinds of beads of wampum, Indian curiosities, and trappings of Indian finery, which he had received in his treaties with different Indian nations. Curiosities sufficient to amuse the curious, unquote. Bloomfield's account is clear in its naming of curiosity as an intellectual motivator. Quote, "My curiosity induced me to pay a visit," unquote, as well as a term that referenced material expressions of artisanal skill and historical memory, trappings of Indian finery, which he had received in his treaty, and a term that also evoked pleasurable experiences, curiosities sufficient to amuse the curious. In later diary entries, Bloomfield records his own efforts to assemble a collection. Slide, please. Sent to Fort Stanwix to report on the state of affairs among members of the Oneida Nation, he reports that he went, quote, with an Indian interpreter and visited most of their huts in quest of Indian wampum, etc. Slide, please. And then back at the camp, he wrote, he rode to Fort Hendrick, 12 miles from hence, and got a pair of elegant leggins made in the Indian fashion, unquote. And these he bought from the widow of Sir William Johnson, who was the Mohawk woman, Molly Brant. During the visit, he admired her young daughters, quote, richly dressed and agreeable to the Indian fashion, unquote. As the summer wore on, Bloomfield also commented on the broader patterns of Indigenous curiosity production that went on in tandem with the formal negotiations. Slide, please. They have their wives and children with them. The wives are generally at work making moccasins and other such things as they use themselves or expect to sell to us, unquote. In such passages in Bloomfield's diary, the needle moves along the continuum of commodity and diplomatic gift production in the direction of the curiosity market. But it moves back again later on when Bloomfield himself becomes the recipient of a diplomatic gift by an Oneida chief. Slide, please. This day, Tescanindo, the head warrior of the Oneidas, dined with me. He made me a present of a red belt or sash worked with beads as a testimony of his regard, arising, I suppose, from my visiting him when at the Oneida Castle and treating him with familiarity since he has been here, unquote. Some of the curiosities Bloomfield collected may be among the many undocumented 18th century items preserved in museum collections, but we can today know them and the positive aesthetic response and specific associations they would have had for him and his family only from the descriptions in his diary. Time does not permit further citation of Joseph Bloomfield's diary, but I don't want to leave it without noting the numerous accounts it contains of his intense sensory responses to Indigenous expressive culture. He is struck by the different sounds of the chorus of languages that surrounds him, and he tried to contrast the sonorous qualities of the 6 Haudenosaunee languages. He hears Mohawk singing in church and regards it as, quote, the most beautiful I have heard. He plays lacrosse with Indigenous men and fellow soldiers. He enjoys a dance that, quote, consists of violent exertions and according to some rules, unquote. Both the degree of Bloomfield's curiosity about Indigenous lifestyles and his respectful assessments were unusual for their time. Nigel Leask and other scholars have explored the fundamental ambivalence with which the phenomenon of curiosity was regarded by many intellectuals and critics during the 18th century, because it could, in their view, easily lead to superficial, disorganized, and useless forms of knowledge. Yet for a man like Bloomfield, whose later life testifies to his liberal political leanings and interests in social justice, an initial stance of curiosity seems to have engendered a greater degree of understanding and respect. Bloomfield would serve several terms as governor of New Jersey in the decade leading up to the War of 1812, and he would join the Freemasons and be elected the first president of the New Jersey Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, a member of the American Antiquarian Society and the Board of Governors of Princeton University. He also married a woman who was an active proponent of women's suffrage. Next slide. John Caldwell, the son of an Anglo-Irish baronet, was in many ways Joseph Bloomfield's opposite number. 3 years younger, he was born in Fermanagh, Northern Ireland, and joined the 8th or King's Regiment of Foot as a lieutenant in the same year, 1776. His regiment was assigned to garrison British forts that were centers for negotiation with Indigenous allies. Military historian Simon Jones has identified the young Caldwell as, quote, one of a small number of officers from his regiment employed in Indian relations at the forts of Niagara and Detroit. Caldwell's father further amplified the role he played in a letter to a friend, quote, during the last 4 years, he was principally employed in delivering the king's presents to the Indians and exchanging with them the war hatchet and wampum. From an uncommon strength of constitution, he was able to live with them 2 hunting seasons and understands their language, unquote. Other accounts suggest that Caldwell took an Indigenous wife, and the young lieutenant seems to have thrown himself into life on the frontier with gusto. His own letters to his father expressed a boyish lust for adventure. Shortly after his arrival in Detroit, he wrote, quote, I never enjoy myself more nor my health better than when on a voyage with a bear skin to sleep on and salt pork for breakfast, unquote. Through Jones' research, we know that in the winter of 1779-80, Caldwell was sent into the highly unstable Ohio Territory to win back the allegiance of tribes who were beginning to lean toward the Americans. A series of important councils was convened in January 1780 by chiefs of the Haudenosaunee, Wendat, Delaware, Shawnee, and Miami. Using accounts of Caldwell's speeches and written descriptions of the now lost wampum belt that he holds in his portrait, Jones demonstrates that Caldwell's grasp of Aboriginal metaphorical language and protocol enabled him to contribute to the success of the British in dissuading a prominent Cherokee leader from joining the Americans. Slide, please. The collection Caldwell amassed, the largest from the Great Lakes that survives from the Revolutionary War years, is a product of the role he played in these diplomatic negotiations. The majority of the items that survive today were acquired by the Canadian Museum of History in the 1970s and include many of the garments and ornaments he wears in his famous portrait, commissioned on his return from North America. An inscription on the back of one of the 2 copies of the portrait states that he is dressed, quote, as he appeared at a grand war council held by him at the Wakitomike village, January 17, 1780. Caldwell's outfit would have been conferred on him during one of the rituals of adoption that were integral to 18th century frontier diplomacy. From an Indigenous perspective, adoption, ritually accomplished by the conferral of a new name and a reclothing, made the British officer a member of an Indigenous kin group who could be expected to uphold its interests in all future eventualities. An expectation most often misunderstood by the European adoptees, who regularly assumed adoption to be an honor that recognized their own chiefly status. In addition to the outfit bestowed on him through adoption, Lieutenant Caldwell must have sought out some new items in his collection in the curiosity market. If we again invoke the image of a needle that moves along a continuum between these 2 poles, the Caldwell collection, as it survives today, is located closer to the diplomatic end, while also manifesting the convergence of the cult of curiosity and the culture of diplomacy. Time does not permit discussion of other surviving 18th century collections, and I can mention only briefly 2 that are closely related to the assemblages made by Farquharson, Bloomfield, and Caldwell. Slide, please. As in the Caldwell collection, the centerpiece of the Foster collection, now in the National Museum of the American Indian, is an outfit that would have been conferred in a ritual adoption. His collection was thus also shaped by the Indigenous culture of diplomacy. Slide, please. In contrast, the Grant collection, now in the National Museum of Ireland, is composed of about 60 beautiful but dissociated items, each of which can be admired and appreciated on its own terms as an example of Indigenous artistry. Slide, please. It thus resembles the Farquharson collection seen here, both of which are primarily informed by the sensibility and the cult of curiosity. Interestingly, women seem to have been the primary agents in the formation of both the Farquharson and Grant collections. We have evidence that it was Isabella Grant and not her husband who actively sought out and assembled the collection known by his name. Tellingly, too, she bequeathed it to her daughter rather than her son, along with her jewelry. Lieutenant Farquharson clearly states in his letters that he was sending his, quote, casket of savage curiosities, unquote, to his patron's wife, the Lady Sinclair. She would be well worth further research. The mother of 12 children, 4 of whom survived into adulthood, the Lady Sinclair is recorded as asking for information about Indigenous methods of nursing and infant care, presumably seeking new and better ways to nurture the young. She also founded a school to teach flax weaving to women on her husband's estate and would have been particularly interested in the textile arts of Indigenous women in distant lands. The roles played by these European women are paralleled by the agencies of the high-status Indigenous women Bloomfield and Farquharson visited in order to purchase Indigenous arts. Alexander Farquharson sought out the widow of the famous Mohawk leader Hendrick, while Joseph Bloomfield visited Sir William Johnson's Mohawk wife, Molly Brant. These Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists, entrepreneurs, and collectors are important not only to understanding the colonial agencies of women, but also to contemporary projects of restitution. If my reading of 18th century collecting practices is correct, many, if not most, of the Indigenous items that have come down to us from the 18th century do not share the status of the large collections made in the 19th and 20th centuries under the aegis of salvage anthropology, racist theories of cultural evolution, assimilationist pressures, and the duress of economic marginalization. As such discussions continue, increasing accessibility to early collections and continuing research on their histories of exchange will remain important. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. And now, Henriette, I wanted to give you an opportunity to discuss how your research has dovetailed so well with Ruth's, and also how you see the ways in which the body of research is being continually added to, and in particular, your research on various collections in Scotland and how this collection fits into that broader context of familial relationships.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. First slide then. So I have had the privilege of working with many of the people on this panel, and possibly the first time I encountered this collection, so the Farquharson collection, was when I first arrived at the National Museum of Scotland, and it was up for sale at Sotheby's. And it had this extraordinary set of entangled relationships. So at one level, it was obviously very closely bound to the land of North America, but then it's also very closely bound to the land of Scotland. And it's very important. I think one of the important things, and Christian and Johanna and I were discussing this, is to think about this in Scottish terms. So Scotland is also a nation that had just been through turmoil. It is post-Culloden, so it is post the sort of capitulation to the English government. So it's after the Union of Crowns and after the Union of Government. It is also after the Darien scheme, which is the almost bankruptcy of the Scottish state. So the Scots themselves have been through turmoil. So this is deeply implicated in that, because a lot of the people that we map in relationship to this collection are in fact people with Jacobite sympathies. And the Black Watch Regiment, which is the 42nd Highlanders, itself a regiment that was involved in English-Scottish battles, and is then incorporated into the British Army, the English Army, as essentially shock troops of empire. So there's this extraordinarily complicated relationship. I'm also, as you can hear, English, not Scottish. I had recently arrived in Scotland, and this extraordinary collection was on the market, And because I worked for a public museum, we didn't have the funds to buy it. So my first encounter with this phenomenal collection was seeing it in an auction catalogue, which we weren't able to obtain. I then had the privilege of going with Ruth to look at the Farquharson archives, so to look at the original letters that documented how this extraordinary collection was essentially, I would say, and I don't know whether Ruth would agree, I think it was offered up to Lady Sinclair. I think it was a sort of tribute. It's almost a tribute to a patron. So not only is it a diplomatic gift within the territory of North America, but it's also a diplomatic gift between someone and a kind of chief or a laird. We can't at the moment trace the relationship between James Farquharson and John Farquharson, his patron, and Lady Sinclair. But it is related to another collection that still remains in Scotland and the property of the Dukes of Atholl. So in a sense, I'm here as pilgrimage because it's 20 years since I first heard of this set of pieces. And I think one of the things that I most appreciate about it is the fact that it has been taken and conveyed through time in its integrity. So we believe that what we see now here in the galleries is what was in the castle in Scotland, which was what was conveyed to the family, and that the family have preserved it. Next slide. This is the place that I worked, which is sort of some historical renderings of the National Museum of Scotland. At the time when National Museum of Scotland was built, so it was built as the Royal Museum in the 1850s. It was the largest public building in Edinburgh. And just giving you a sense of its scale, I'm going to go through a sort of reverse history. So next slide. The National Museum of Scotland is essentially, it is the sum of different little rivers. So one river, this is the post-Culloden Scottish context is a context in which people are building a kind of literate and enlightenment culture. So there are a number of different institutions, the University of Edinburgh, the Royal Society, the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. All these learned societies are accumulating collections, and North America figures in all of them, and North America from the Northeast and the upper Great Lakes area. So one of the elements, again, to come back to this collection, is the relationship with documentation and material culture, or the objects that you see in front of you, the artworks that you see in front of you. So if you work in these historic collections in Europe, you spend quite a lot of time going back through the archives trying to figure out, do you know the moment at which it arrived in? And so this is the University of Edinburgh Royal Charter, which was made in 1812. So the University of Edinburgh is one of the oldest collecting institutions in Scotland. And these garters were brought into the university by someone called Andrew Graham, who was a Hudson Bay Company factor. So one of the big elements of Indigenous North American presence in Scotland in collections is through the Hudson Bay Company. So one level, it's the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, the Guerre de la Conquête, or on the other hand, it is the proactive involvement of Scottish people in the Hudson Bay Company. So next slide. The other really important society is the Society of Antiquaries, a group of impressive post-Jacobite leaders in Scotland who came together in 1780 against the political backdrop of the reconciliation of Scotland to the wider political domain of the United Kingdom, but also through a romantic and unpolitical enthusiasm for anything Scottish. So David Stuart Erskine, who was the Earl of Buchan, petitioned for a royal charter in the 1780s, and they created, it became a repository, so the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland, and this is the minutes of the society. And in that, if you could read the minutes, it's basically saying we need an inventory because all of this material is coming in, but we're not taking note of it, and antiquarians would borrow from the collection. So they would assemble a curiosity collection, and then the antiquarians would borrow from it. Next slide, please. So some of the earliest pieces that are now in the National Museum of Scotland that came through the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland are pipe tomahawks, which you saw in those representations that Rue showed, and the one at the top has a date of 1769. So you can see as early as just after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, you were getting pipe tomahawks in Scottish collections. Next slide. And this is the collection of someone called Charteris. And again, this comes back to, if you could read the description of that collection, you've got a description that mirrors very closely the types of pieces that you've got in the Farquharson collection. They're collecting moccasins, they're collecting finger-woven sashes, they're collecting bags. The Earl of Charteris was also the Earl of Wemyss, and he also belonged to the Grand Lodge, so the Masonic Society, to which the Earl of Buchan belonged, so the head of the Society of Antiquaries. And he was also linked through his brother, who was called Lord Elcho, or David Wemyss, to the Jacobite rebellion. So a lot of these people who were creating these societies are operating in in this political context. And that political context transfers over to the 42nd Highlanders, which is the regiment that James Farquharson was part of, and that Alexander Farquharson was part of. Okay, next slide. So that's to show really the relationship, and the next slide, between that which is in the Farquharson collection and which came through the Charteris collection and still is in these historic collections in Scotland. So you can, the repetition. Next slide. So in the broad Scottish context, this enlightenment and dedication to public instruction was then translated into the National Museum of Scotland. And these are two brothers, George Wilson, who was the head of the National Museum, and Daniel Wilson, who worked for the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, but then was sort of almost exiled, if you can say that, and apologies to my Canadian colleagues, to the University of Toronto. He worked in the University of Toronto, and these two brothers, in an extraordinary fashion, worked with the Hudson Bay Company to secure, next slide, to secure this enormous collection of Indigenous North American material culture that resides now in the National Museum of Scotland. It's the sister collection to the National Museum of the American Indian. And it creates a date stamp. It's from 1858 to 1862. They collected widely throughout the Hudson Bay Company factors, Hudson Bay Company men, and a little bit like the Farquharson collection, it is an assemblage. It's extractive in the sense that people are selecting. They're selecting through relationships, and they're documenting what they're selecting. And that's a very extraordinary moment in sort of historical terms and the ability to understand collections. And it gives you a nuance of that relationship. What were those individuals that were all joining at that moment doing, and what were they depositing as a meaningful objects? And we were discussing this today, people often think of museums as orientated towards the past, particularly if they have historic collections. But it's important to think about sometimes people's intentions are to catapult that into the future. They're creating a whole assemblage of sentiment, relationships, and productivity. So the National Museum of Scotland was an industrial museum. It was really interested in the way things were made and what they meant and how they functioned, and whether people in Edinburgh could learn from people halfway across the world. So that is the beauty of having collections like the Farquharson collection. Next slide. So as a consequence of my entirely happy and long-term relationship with GlasSalon, I became very interested. So the military collection at the National Museum of Scotland is a 20th century essentially iteration of the museum. So museums go through these iterative processes. And because I worked in a multidisciplinary museum, I became very interested in this particular item, which is a powder horn. Again, it comes from the 42nd Highlanders, it comes from the Black Watch Regiment. As you see, it has this poem, which seems to be the relationship, it depicts the relationship between Jonathan Webb, who is one character that's in the poem, and George Cameron, who is the person that we know worked for or was a soldier in the 42nd Highlanders. And I was very interested because I was very interested for Grassack in the strap. And whilst there are many powder horns that are produced during this period that are either kept in North American collections or indeed in European collections, very few of them have indigenous straps. So there are a few instances you can sort of cite, there are about 7 that are published. And one of them was in the National Museum of Scotland. And this led to a conversation with a military historian about what did we know about these objects and how that allows us to understand this moment in time, the relationship between British troops, Scottish troops, working in circumstances which are very different to the normal prosecution of European warfare. So they're in a country they don't recognize. They are having to be much faster. They're having to negotiate woodland terrain. And as they do this, they start to adopt the technology that they know to be most suited to that terrain. And that technology comes to them through their indigenous allies. Next slide. So this led to a project that I have worked on for a number of years about the relationship between military museums and material culture, or the relationship between war and objects, and how these important early collections, one of which was at the Rotunda, which is the Royal Artillery Museum, and the other one, which is the Royal United Services Institute, which ended up being a museum for the army, how they accumulated collections and where those collections have gone, because neither of these institutions exist in this form any longer. But the Rotunda, for example, if you're going overseas and staging warfare, you need the engineers and you need the artillery. And the Artillery Museum was created in order to have military intelligence. So one of the reasons the British Army collected arms was to understand other people's military intelligence. Next slide. And this is to show, so if you look at the sort of ancestral Great Lakes collections throughout European museums, and they come through a variety of ways, and some come through Hessian mercenaries. This one is currently in the British Museum, and so one of the projects that we were doing was about the provenance of things. Could you track these items back? How far could you track them back? When was the first catalogue? Do we recognize who the figure is? Because one of the elements of military collecting is the figures have service records. So you can track them through time. So they become these very clear personalities, and you can understand what they were doing there at the time. So this is a very important bag. It currently resides in the British Museum. It came from the Royal Artillery Museum. It then came through a dealer called Harry Beasley, who then sold it to the British Museum. But we know as early as the 1860s, it was already in the museum. Next slide. So this led to a further investigation of, in particular, powder horns in military museums and where they came from. And this one came through another link to essentially the aristocratic families of Scotland. So many of the aristocratic families, the Atholls, the Buchans, the Farquharsons, ended up either serving in the 42nd Highlanders or having associations with it. And so this is actually that information that you see on the right is public information. So we essentially surveyed a lot of the military museums in the UK and recorded those pieces that came from American collections. Next slide. And so here again, you see two pieces that come from two regimental museums, and you see that there is these powder horns, which are adorned and probably kept by British soldiers and Scottish soldiers because they referenced a very particular type of military engagement, which is kind of irregular warfare. So military men are very interested in when they do something in a kind of notably idiosyncratic way. And so irregular warfare was being memorialized by the powder horns. But then on the top there, you have a quill work strap. And that strap looks like the prisoner ties that you find from the Upper Great Lakes at this period and that were used by Indigenous nations. Similarly, you can see the quilled strap there, and that piece comes dates from the American War of Independence. Next, finally, yeah. So looking through the Blackwatch archives, we were also looking at order books, and these order books record the kinds of supplies that go in and out of, that are taken into the stores and issued to military men. And as we looked at those during this period, during the 1750s to the early 1760s, you can also see that some of the material that we now see in collections and some of the material that you see in the Farquharson exhibition was being issued to the military. So to talk really to Ruth's point about women's work and how we understand the role of women in all this and the creation of material culture and objects and artwork, bags and moccasins and straps. They're also being bought by the British Army and reissued to their military, the men that are serving. And if you take the last slide. So unfortunately, I got the dates transposed, but the orderly book from Staten Island is 1861, and that's actually the date. That's more or less the time and the date when Alexander Farquharson was writing to Lady Sinclair and saying to her, I will convey a set of curiosities to you. So you can see at that point, it's, so basically what they're doing is they're asking the men who've got leggings and fellowbigs, which are these sort of kilts, they're kind of they're asking them to return them and then telling them how long they can wear all of this thing. So the supernumerary tomahawks and powder horns and shot bags belonging to the Light Infantry Company, and it was a light infantry of the 42nd Highlanders, also to be delivered into the store. So you are to return everything that you don't use back, and they're issuing it. So the pipe tomahawks that you've seen, the powder horns that you've seen, and the shot bags are all part of British military issue at this point. I think that's all I want to say.
Thank you. So we're gonna pivot now to Annette and talk about specifically one of the things that I particularly emphasized in the exhibition that highlights the work of women, and not just their creative acts, but also the important role that they did play in this political landscape. So for Indigenous women, that role was actually very dominant in the production of objects for sale and trade, but also for this military regalia. So Annette, you are up.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all, the organizers, for bringing us all together today. It is a great pleasure to join this rich discussion and to have the opportunity to study the artworks in the Farquharson collection. In my talk today, I'll focus on 4 items: the embroidered birch bark notebook, the wall pocket calling card tray, and the embroidered hide moccasins. Next slide, please. Thank you. These artworks, having now entered a public collection, come more fully into conversation with national and international collections of Indigenous artworks. Ruth Phillips and Dale Idiens made the critically important introduction to the Farquharson collection and opened a door for the study today. I will discuss these 4 artworks, thinking of Indigenous women's history brought together with a close study of their artworks. I position the works in the context of what I suggest is a creative network that connected the Wendat of Wendake, the Abenaki of Odanak, of the St. Lawrence River Valley and women artists of the Wallastoqiuk and Mi'kmaq communities of what is today New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Maine. The role of these women artists is central to my talk. Women's creative networks, the sharing of forms, designs, aesthetic interest, and cosmological meanings that their arts embodied, strengthened the cultural, political, and economic alliances between their nations. I suggest that these 4 artworks are actually made from women from these communities. I suggest a Wendat artist made and embroidered the black-dyed moccasins. A Wallastoqiuk or Mi'kmaq artist made and embroidered the calling card tray and wall pocket. For the notebook, in my analysis, I'm still of 2 minds that it might be the work of a Quebec convent nun, and also it could be by a Wallastoqiuk or Mi'kmaq artist. I suggest that these 4 items illustrate women's creative and diplomatic networks that maintained alliances between their nations. This is a fresh area of study for me, and I'm delighted to share it with you all, and I look forward to having your feedback. So my plan for my talk today, I'll give a brief description of the ancestral arts of Wendat, Wallastoqiuk, and Mi'kmaq communities, which we know mainly from 17th and 18th century missionary text descriptions. To support their communities, women artists adapted these ancestral art forms to produce an array of souvenir arts and diplomatic gifts, examples of which we see in the Farquharson items. Next, I will describe the close connections between Wendat, Wallastoqiuk, and Mi'kmaq communities and the extensive visiting and travel between their villages, homes, and hunting territories. I'll share 2 stories that demonstrate this community connectedness, which supports my suggestion that the artworks illustrate a creative and diplomatic network of women artists. From there, I'll share my close study of the artworks. I compare them with artworks of known origins to support my suggestions of their makers and provenance, and that the artworks demonstrate my thoughts about a creative diplomatic network. First, an overview of ancestral arts. In the early 17th century, Recollet missionary Gabrielle Sagard admired Wendat women's skills in achieving vivid colors of red, black, blue, and white in the quill work they embroidered on hide game bags and pouches, colors that were much more vivid than the French could achieve, said Sagard. Father Lemoyne described the quilled bark bowls Mi'kmaq and Wallastoqiuk women sold to French fishermen in the 17th century and earlier. In 1721, Jesuit missionary Father Charlevoix described Wendat women's artwork, the ties they made for quilt designs on bark, as well as painted and embroidered hide work and twined garters and belts. These ancestral traditions developed into the commercial wares and diplomatic wares we see in the Farquharson collection. To give context to my suggestion of creative networks, I'll describe the close relations between Wendat, Wallastoqiuk, and Mi'kmaq nations. Today, ancestral Indigenous territories of the Northeast are divided by colonial borders of Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Maine. And in the late 18th century, when men of the Farquharson family were acquiring these artworks, colonial borders were increasingly imposed. However, Indigenous nations of this region maintained their own ancient and territorial agreements and alliances. Key to maintaining these alliances were protocols of regular diplomatic visits between nations. Sagard described the great distances the Wendat traveled for these visits. 1,300 kilometers or 800 miles was a regular distance for travel. Today, Quebec City to Halifax is about 1,000 kilometers or 650 miles. And then traveling direct routes by canoe and overland, this was much shorter. So delegations from nations of the St. Lawrence and the Atlantic region traveled these distances annually to neighboring hunting territories and on formal visits to discuss matters of shared concern. And this would usually, in the colonial period, have been probably outside the vision and awareness of colonial administrators and militaries. Gift exchange was a central element to these visits. And the gifts were artworks made by women of each nation. For example, for the Wendat, embroidered moccasins were selected as diplomatic gifts. And a Wendat elder explained that the moccasins chosen were the best of women's production. From this, we know that women artists were recognized in their own communities and beyond for their creative excellence, and they played an important role to maintain diplomatic and economic alliances. 2 stories demonstrate the close connections between these 3 nations. One is of marriage. In the early 19th century, Wendat Grand Chief Nicholas Vincent Sauenhoe's second wife was Madeline Thomas, who was Wallastoqiuk. She was the widow of Penobscot chief Pierre-Jacques Thomas of what is today Maine. Their family history demonstrates the family, clan, and community networks that actually united this region outside colonial understandings of boundaries. A story of events during the War of 1812 demonstrates the knowledge of land and hunting territories shared by Wendat, Wolastoqiyik, and Mi'kmaq communities. In the winter of 1814, the British military needed reinforcements on the St. Lawrence River. British troops had arrived in Halifax, but in midwinter, the frozen St. Lawrence was not open to ships. 9 Wendat warriors volunteered to guide the troops overland from Halifax to Quebec City across the snow and frozen lakes and rivers. The Wendat guides brought all the troops safely to Quebec City, and this is a testament not only to Wendat men's expert winter survival skills and deep knowledge of the territory, but to their comfort and frequent travel over what were negotiated Wendat, Mi'kmaq, and Wolastoqiyik hunting territories. So now I've given you a brief description of the ancestral arts techniques that we see in the Farquharson collection. And I've given you an overview of the connections between these communities to give sort of a context to what I see as creative networks that were part of diplomatic and supported and sustained diplomatic alliances. Now I'd like to talk about each of the 4 items to explain how I see them as artworks of women from different communities and the women's role they represent. So Indigenous makers, women makers, chose the forms of the notebook, the wall pocket, and calling card tray to appeal to European collectors. They were specifically associated with European women's domestic sphere. The Wendat moccasins that you see here in this image, played 2 roles. In the Wendat community, they were worn as special occasion wear by Wendat women, and also they were made to be sold as commercial wares, as prized collectibles to European military and visitors. As Ruth Phillips and Dale Idians discussed in their article, these souvenirs were probably acquired by men in the Farquharson family for their women relatives. What interests me is the artist's choices of stitches as expressions of the hands of the individual artist and their community aesthetic, and what these choices tell us about the community of origin. So I'm going to start with the moccasins. And the moccasins are embroidered in quill and moose hair in a couching technique. Bundles of moose hair or fine quill are stitched to the surface of the hide using cotton thread. These moccasins are what I have described as the harvest style. And this style is associated with ribbon-trimmed vertical or folded cuff black-dyed hide moccasins with puckered vant seams. And these are usually associated as moccasins that are worn by and made for women. The motifs in the harvest style, as you can see, are exuberant, stylized foliate plant motifs, and they've got this beautiful vocabulary of ovoids and spirals and free-flowing stems in a balanced, asymmetric, abstract arrangement. Next slide, please. In this slide, I show the development of Wendat embroidery styles on hide from the late 18th century, which was the time of the Farquharson collection, to the early 19th century. The moccasins on the upper left illustrate the harvest style in full expression. The bilateral contrasted colors in a single motif and borders in contrasting colors are characteristic. And then on the right are the moccasins acquired by Lady Elgin, closer to mid-19th century. And there you can see a movement towards a more naturalistic representation of flower blossoms and stems. Next slide, please. So going back to the harvest style, I suggest that this is a visual metaphor representing Wendat women's connection to the land and their responsibilities and knowledge as farmers, producing the crops that sustain their people. I also suggest the motifs represent women's knowledge of botany for healing, as well as the plants used to dye quill and moose hair. One of the things I think is really interesting is that the motifs that you see on the vamp were oriented towards the woman wearer. So when she would look down, she would see these motifs that represented these close connections and her really important role in her community. Next slide, please. In this slide, this on the right is the cuff of the Farquharson moccasin, and this is a detail of one of the motifs. The artist who embroidered these moccasins I think was working in a transitional style. Most of the elements on the moccasin are in the harvest style, but this one blossom looks toward the naturalistic style of the Elgin moccasin. It has a more naturalistic look, and the naturalistic style had this characteristic much thicker line of stitches that surrounded and bordered the blossoms. Next slide, please. I'll now move on to discussion of the bark work. The technique of embroidery on bark work in these examples is to make a small hole in the bark with an awl or a needle, and then push the point of the fine quill through the hole, pulling it through the other side for each stitch. And then a bark backing was placed over the back of the embroidered piece to hide and protect the quill ends. These are the three souvenir arts. There's the notebook on the left, and then on the top right is the wall pocket, and then the calling card tray is on the bottom right. Next slide, please. These pages from a notebook by Victoria Wade show the techniques of embroidery, the stitches that were characteristic of the Wendat, Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and convent works. The artists who made all the works in this collection were expert in satin stitch, long and short stitch, stem stitch, and berry stitch. And what makes each work distinct from my study indicates the community of origin, how each artist used these stitches to give a specific desired effect. Next slide, please. Okay, this is another image. This one shows exactly how to do a French knot or berry stitch. Next slide, please. So this is an image of the de Lanaudière carafe holders, Wendat artists mid to later 18th century. Wendake was a center of embroidered bark souvenir art production. However, I suggest that the Farquharson bark works were actually not by Wendat artists. The first thought is to think they were because the Wendat were so well known and had such an extensive production. But I'll show you why I think the Farquharson artworks are not by Wendat makers. The key Wendat motifs in these flagon holders are the strawberry, which you can see on the top one on the left and the detail below, and the blue convolvulus flower blossom, which you can see on the right. The strawberry has important cosmological meanings in Wendat beliefs, and the convolvulus has strong healing powers associated with Wendat women's role as healers. Wendat embroidery artists made a balanced use of all the stitches. They used the satin stitch, long and short stitch to give shading, and the stem stitch, and the iconography of the strawberry and convolvulus is really characteristic of their work. None of these motifs appear on the Farquharson artworks, bark work, which made me question originally, maybe they actually weren't by a Wendat maker, and made me think about other possibilities. Next slide, please. And this is an example of Quebec convent work. So I'm sort of giving you ideas about the artists who I think actually did not make these works. And so you can sort of see my analysis of where the directions that I took, and then how I start thinking about networks of creativity. So this reticle base, the iconography, is in the center image. You can see the European trope of the unclothed noble savage. On one of the panels, there's a ceremonial pipe, a seated figure smoking a ceremonial pipe. And then on a panel on the upper left, you can see the Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, the symbol of Christ's sacrifice. Together, these motifs are a metaphor for conversion and missionary goals. To achieve realism and a high level of detail and shading, the nun artist used mainly long and short stitch with very small areas of satin stitch or semstitch. She used French knots to give great realism in her depiction of the lamb's wool. Next slide, please. So now we come to the Farquharson notebook. And this has been dated. Inside there is text to date it to 1775. And I've looked at this little notebook for a long time, and I talk myself back and forth. I'm coming down towards, I actually do think it was made by a Wolastoqiyik or Mi'kmaq artist, but sometimes I go back to thinking it's a convent maker. What is making me sort of wonder about it is that the maker uses both the long and short stitch and is interested in using shading to give texture and three-dimensionality. But there are two motifs, the top one above the tondo, the circle, and then the main motif in the tondo are used making satin stitch to give the petals, but they focus on actually making them really flat without any kind of shading, without interest in shading. Next slide, please. So this is a close-up of the back of the commonplace book or notebook from the Farquharson collection. And when you look at the flower below the tondo, the two blossoms on either side use the shading of the long and short stitch, but the blossom in the middle does not. It's a different kind of representation and a different interest in representing without three-dimensionality. Next slide, please. And this is, I just was looking long and hard at these. The two on the top, on the left is a convent work, a convent notebook, and on the right is the detail of the reticule base, and below are images from the Farquharson collection. And there I was seeing most definitely a style and technique that is associated with Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq barch work. Next slide, please. So here is the stunning Farquharson collection calling card tray, which I argued is part of this creative network, and it was one of my strongest thoughts towards the Wolastoqiyik and Mi'kmaq artist maker. Next slide, please. So this is a comparison that really supports this thinking about multiple artists having contributed to the bark work from the region. On the right is a cigar case made by a Mi'kmaq artist. And this one has recently sort of come into discussion. It was acquired by the Nova Scotia Museum of Nature and Science. Roger Lewis, who's the curator of Mi'kmaq cultural heritage at the museum and a member of the Indian Brook Mi'kmaq First Nations community, explained that this cigar box was acquired from a Mi'kmaq community member. And what I want to look at is, if you look at the central motif in the bottom of the cigar box, it has these rows of satin stitch in like concentric circles, and it does not use shading. And this looks very similar to the motif, the floral motif that is on the Farquharson calling card tray. Next slide, please. And here's another detail of the Farquharson calling card tray, where I was looking again at the extensive use of satin stitch and just a very different approach to representing motifs. Next slide, please. This is another example. This is of either Mi'kmaq or Wolastoqiyik bark work. It's from the Pitt Rivers Museum, and it was collected by Woodford, who was traveling in the Atlantic provinces. And from the acquisition records, the suggestion is that this was acquired from a Mi'kmaq or Wolastoqiyik maker. And I was looking again at this very similar approach, a very flat and tiered rows of stitching. Next one, please. And just wrapping up, this is the wall pocket. And when one looks at it, again, it's that same approach to the stitching and just a different way of thinking about producing the floral motifs. Okay, so I'm going to conclude. To sum up, I suggest the makers of these 4 items come from as many as 4 different arts communities, 3 Indigenous communities, and possibly a convent artist. Yeah, I'm not going to be talking about these. I have them there for interest. This fits with Aeneas McIntosh as the collector during the Revolutionary War. My concluding thought is about the role of creative networks of Wendat, Wolastoqiyik, and Mi'kmaq women artists. References are often made to meetings between chiefs of these and other nations. Less frequently is it mentioned that the wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters of chiefs were often also present. Their voices carried weight in their communities, then as now. Women visited very likely discussed their creative work. They also would have discussed important issues related to their nations. In this way, I suggest, they strengthened each other in their diplomatic and commercial arts production and strengthened family, clan, and their nation's diplomatic ties. Thank you.
Thank you. I was really looking forward to that presentation because if it wasn't obvious in my tours, that's some of my favorite objects in the collection is the embroidered work. And then Christiane, you bring us an amazing perspective to share on the connections to contemporary Indigenous artistic practice and the similarities and differences you see in practice and purpose when we compare what we see in this exhibition to the broader art historical scene. So you're on.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank Joanna and Duffy for both inviting me to be here and also for the very warm welcome. I have to say it's a little bit daunting to be on this panel just because these are all luminaries whose writing and presentations I have read over the years. I feel like a little bit of an interloper. I'm a historian by training. I'm not a museum professional and I'm not an art historian, but we'll work with that. So, first slide, please. I'm going to come back to this image a little bit like Annette. I wanted something that had visual interest while I was talking. And I guess the place that I wanted to start, I didn't write a formal presentation for today, but the place that I wanted to start was really in emphasizing, I think, one of the things that is truly extraordinary about this collection and how fortunate all of you are to be able to interact with it in Toledo and for all of us as scholars and art historians to think about it is the fact that it is in its integrity. And I think people sometimes underestimate the sensibility of, oh, it's just a few things or it's only one room. And yet, as I hope you've been getting out of the presentations that have preceded this, while there are a number of exemplars, you can see that they are in multiple institutions on multiple continents. And so to be able to have something that was in its entirety is actually quite extraordinary. My background and training is in the French Atlantic world. So I'm a historian of cultural histories of war that took place in the 18th century French Atlantic. And initially, when Joanna had invited me to be on this panel, she had asked if I could talk about the relationships forged between Indigenous artists and their European counterparts and what kinds of appreciations and appropriations took place. And ultimately, what I realized is I can't actually speak to that. And in part, it's because New France as a colony doesn't have the same kind of artistic legacy that you see in, say, British colonies. So Montreal and Quebec are not the same kinds of places for commissions as Philadelphia and Boston might have been. And that's sort of the first ways in which that plays out. But the second, sort of more relevant part, and this is where I see a really profound connection to what is available in terms of thinking with the Farquharson collection, is there are no French counterparts to this collection. So even though during the 7 Years' War, you have a corps of French officers and French soldiers who are delegated to go from mainland France to defend the crown colony in New France. They're there from 1755 until 1760, when New France is ceded and then later ceded at a formal treaty in 1763. There's nothing that comes back to France, or at least that is extant, that looks like this. So while we have the journals of these officers, while we have the letters that they are writing to their peers, we have no material culture that speaks to this. And so as a historian, part of what's so exciting about the Farquharson collection is it allows me to begin to imagine what they might have encountered, what kinds of items they might have been able to purchase and send home as curiosities, as evidence of their time abroad, and to think about either why they didn't choose to make these purchases, or more significantly, what might have happened to that material when it came elsewhere. And I'll give you two examples of this. The first is the French commander who led the French forces in New France, the Marquis de Montcalm de Saint-Véran. We do have his extant letters to his mother, the Marquise de Montcalm, and to his sister, the Mademoiselle de Montcalm. He writes a great deal about his observations of Indigenous peoples. They are, for the most part, not flattering. He is very critical of his Canadian counterparts and what he perceives to be a kind of undermining of French cultural identity and French practice in their relationships with Indigenous peoples. But he does provide a lot of observation, and it opens this question, as with the Lady Sinclair, would he have sent material back? And the best guess that I can have is possibly yes. I know that he was asking his mother to be able to send him things that he missed from home. He was from Provence. So he was asking for Turkish figs and lavender water and lace. He asks for a baker to be sent, which is kind of a wild thing to ask for during wartime. Who does not survive, I should add. He makes it to Canada, but doesn't make it out. But there's no mention of the kinds of material culture that would have been sent back. The other example is actually one of his staff officers, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville, who becomes very famous for completing the first French global circumnavigation, who writes about this experience in the 1760s and publishes this in the 1770s. And one of the things that we know about Bougainville through his letters to his own patron, to Madame Hérault de Séchelles, who was not a blood relative, but who had materially advanced his career as an officer, is that he talks about his own adoption into the Ganawage community in his letters to Madame Hérault de Séchelles. And in that sense, some of the images that Henrietta shared and that Ruth had shared are really helpful because we have none of that material available. He does not describe it in his letters. He only talks about the name that he receives, but it helps us to imagine what that materiality would have looked like. We do also know from these letters, there's one very cryptic line in one letter where he talks about having engaged in a relationship that would have displeased his, as he calls her, his mother, his patroness. And historians have speculated that this was a relationship with a woman at Ganawage. The evidence that we have for this is this one line. And then later in the early 19th century, a French ambassador who's traveling through the Missouri country reports having met a son of Bougainville there. It turns out it wasn't a son, it was a daughter. Bougainville's son in France, when he provides his papers to the French National Library, writes a topper on this saying, this is a little note about my Indigenous brother. So we know that there may have been this relationship. What material would have been from that relationship, we don't know. If his patroness was unhappy about this relationship, though, my guess is that Bougainville would not have been sending things like this back to France, right? He's very aware of the criticality around this. And so what Farquharson has really helped me to do as a scholar working with a dearth of sources is to envision what this might have been and where it might have gone. The best guess that I can have of why we don't have a parallel set of collections within France is the multiple upheavals of revolution. The French Revolution, obviously, in 1789, that leads to a tremendous kind of upending of aristocratic material culture. And then you have a series of revolutions in the 19th century, again, right, 1830, 1848, that leads to ever greater displacement. And so while there is a core of diplomatic material that was provided to the crown that survived this, most of this more informal exchange that passed through aristocratic military families is gone. And so from that perspective, this is an incredible space to restore these legacies. The reason that I put this image up with the title Many Canoes is when Henrietta and Joanna and I were sitting yesterday in the exhibition gallery, one of the things that we were thinking about was, one, how evocative this exchange is. There is a way in which this scene is the linchpin to the collection as a whole, right? It's kind of the guide of how to put these things together. You can see the material culture, the sashes, the beading, um, the straps that are on some of the elements here, the cradle board, all of these, I think, helped when they were transferred back to Scotland. Those who were receiving these understand how these materials fit together, particularly since the person who had been sending them home did not survive the Havana campaign. And so that's super interesting as a starting point. Each one of these photographs, so what we've got here in the upper left is the image from the Sotheby's catalog from 2022. Below it in black and white is an image that was reproduced in a 1994 article by Ruth Phillips in the Journal of the History of Collections. The image in the upper right is actually from Ruth's presentation, and hopefully Ruth is going to be able to tell me where that one is from because I don't know. And the image in the lower right is from the Sotheby's catalog from 2005. And I put these together because what you'll notice is that the placement of the figures is different in each of these images. You'll notice that in two of the images, the female figure is not wearing her cap, right? Her hair is out. In two of the images, the lower left and the upper right, they look very similar, but you can tell from the strap placement that they're not. The cradle board is not in the canoe. Henrietta sort of referred to this as the baby is in the water, which I found is a really kind of evocative phrase here. Uh, but this question of how are these figures being placed? How are these materials being put together? You'll also notice that the image in the lower right, there's a spoon that's featured that is not in the other images. So how are people understanding these materials as they pass through time, as they're being put together, when they are separated from the letters, the notebooks, all of the kind of ephemera that survives this? And I just want to emphasize that this opens up a space for the kind of interdisciplinary dialogue that is absolutely essential in having these integrated collections, in having the people who are working with the archives be able to restore these kinds of descriptions, the diaries, the memories, the letters, and also those who are working on the collections and who have these incredible narratives of provenance that come together. So the thing that I noticed in these images is there's a way in which I think audiences often approach these as traditional or historical work. And we have to remember that at the time that these were made, these were contemporary works of art. They are representing what would have been seen and known in that moment. You know, one of the reasons that they're being purchased is because they are a way of making tangible the kinds of sights that would have been experienced by European officers coming into these spaces. And so in that sense, they are, as Henrietta was saying, they're looking to the past, but they're also looking to the future in really interesting ways. Next slide, please. So what I thought I would do, the image on the right is from the exhibition that's here at the Toledo Museum of Art, is to put this together with some work by contemporary Indigenous artists to think about the ways in which there are these relationships and productive questions that come out of this. So the images on the left are by the late artist Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who was a Salish member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nations. In the image above, we have an installation view from a show called Making Medicine, which featured, bless you, a number of her works that had a theme of canoes. This is something that had been part of her practice since the 1990s. In paintings such as Trade Canoe for Don Quixote, where she was using canoes to represent sort of iconic images of trade and exchange, the ways in which canoes are appropriated for the purpose of imperial expansion in the 19th century, particularly by the United States into the West, and that she would fill with images of the kind of violence that accompanied this, the violence of forced assimilation and forced conversion, the violence of commodity goods that fundamentally damaged not just Indigenous ecosystems, but also Indigenous lifeways and knowledge. The image on that is inset below that is from a series called Paper Dolls for a Post-Columbian World, that really kind of represented the havoc wreaked by colonial and imperial expansion, both beginning in the 18th century, but really kind of taking on a life of its own in the 19th and 20th centuries with conversion and boarding schools. And so you sort of have the menacing Jesuit figure in the upper left and an Indigenous family, and the paper doll images representing the kinds of futures that were being imagined for them by the colonial state of service and illness and disease, as opposed to their own lifeways. And when you contrast that with this birch bark model canoe and the family that you see here, right, this is an integrated family. This is a family that's whole, which means in this contemporary moment, one of the things we can see as viewers and also as historians is this is a world where the determining future is not that which Jean Quick-to-See Smith was going to be presenting and reflecting on, right? This is a world where Indigenous sovereignty very much is at the core. And so to have this collection come home reopens these questions of the continuity, survivance, and sovereignty of these communities. Next slide, please. So these are works by contemporary artist Marie Watt, who is Seneca and Scott German, which also has a sort of interesting, I guess, connection to the Farquharson collection and the legacies of Scotland. And the reason that I wanted to focus on her work in relationship to what Annette had just been talking about is because what you see here is the really kind of central role that contemporary female Indigenous artists have had in advancing language about artistic sovereignty as well as arguments around land back. So the idea of Turtle Island and or Sky Woman, the kind of central role of women in this. There's a line in the exhibition from Seneca community manager Michael Galvin, who talks about women as creators, right? And you really see this from what Annette was talking about. Women as creators of diplomatic policy and protocol, women as creators of the kind of material exchange. This is something that is still being continued by female artists who are engaging in many similar practices, but they're using materials that are updated to our contemporary moment. So there are ways in which I see a complete correlation between the kind of Indian or Czech or vintage glass beads that are being used by artists like Marie Watt with the trade silk and beads that are appearing in these 18th century collections that were being made by Indigenous women in that moment in the 18th century. I didn't put an image of it here, but one of the things that Marie Watt also does is use trade cloth that is still being provided by the US government to matriarchs of the Seneca community as work that she then beads onto as a living testament to these sovereign relationships that have been maintained since the 18th century as part of her practice. Next slide, please. So here are two more works by two more contemporary artists. Maria Hupfield, who is an Anishinaabe artist, who does a lot of installations that are then activated with performance. This is from a work that is sort of what she would describe as a living sculpture that I think is a really helpful way for us to think about figures like the canoe, birch bark, and figurines, right? This is not something that's meant to be a static representation. You sort of saw that with the photographs that showed the figures moving around. But this notion that there are embodiments of relationships that are still invested in this. And again, in her work, using industrial felt as well as creating silver and tin jingles to adorn it, this notion that she's still using whatever is available and that there is this relationship between a kind of military industrial complex in the materiality of what artists are using that are coming out. And then the work on the right is by Tanya Willard, who is a Sewampik artist. And I included this because it can be a little hard to see, so I would suggest squinting at the image that might bring it into focus. It's the actual work is about the size of the screen itself, and it's a little bit easier to see. And this was a critique of the kind of loss of knowledge that can take place in the archives. So Tanya Willard had first encountered this image of this woman in the archives of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver that was just described as a Shawap native. That was it. And several years later, she found the exact same photograph in her family archives that identified this individual as a relative, identified who she was the sister of, it identified what reserve she lived on, right? All of this sort of knowledge that had been stripped out of the UBC archives. And ultimately, she used that to think about representation and sort of a criticism of the ways in which knowledge can be stripped out. And so again, I see this as being work that is in dialogue with what would otherwise be thought of maybe as historic material in the Farquharson collection, right? That these are spaces that visitors can come to learn about the kind of diplomatic and artistic relationships that are taking place in the 18th century, but they are also spaces that enable a kind of relationship and renewal of these exchanges diplomatically and aesthetically with living contemporary Indigenous artists who may be from the community or may not be from the community, but that are really able to use these as spaces to reimagine what the museum can do and what those dynamic contemporary relationships are to help us get to new questions. So I'm going to cut it off there because I know that Alain has a lot more to say, but thank you for this.
we're more or less right on time. So that's great news. And then Alan, I positioned you at this important role of kind of tying all of this together for us. Your discussion about the Calumet pipe in particular, I think is a really important overarching concept for this exhibition, and that is the importance of diplomacy, of negotiation, of understanding sovereign spaces, and how this one object type really symbolizes this practice in very specific ways. Alan.
Bonjour, miigwech. My name's Alan Corbier. I'm from here in Chiging First Nation on Manitoulin Island. I'm a Anishinaabe and part Potawatomi, part Odawa, and part Ojibwe. So thank you for the invitation. We miigwech weal gunduk enkijik. I want to thank the workers here who put this together, as well as those that invited me. And I've been researching pipes for a while, and this one is exciting. I didn't get to go see it in person yet, and I was looking forward to actually seeing it in person. And well, there's a number of reasons why to see it in person. But one of the things that I guess what I was able to do was thankfully Michael Galbin and Kara Krimpotich and Mikanak Migwans actually shared some pictures with me, as well as some video. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to start off with was these are images. Many of you may have seen this already. Like I know, like Ruth has, and Anne as well, Henrietta as well. But one of the things that's long fascinated me was the longevity of the use of the pipe, as well as its ubiquity. And what we see here are these images taken from the Codex Canadiensis, and it's by Louis Nicolas. And it was published, well, around 1700. But the one on the left here, it says that's an Odawa person. And then he's got a tattoo of the sun on his chest. And then you have also Nadawesu. And of course, some of you may know that Nadawesu is actually, they took off the first part of the word Nadawe, and it's just now that's known as the Sioux people. And then you got the captain of the nation of the Illinois, and he's on the very left, and he's the one smoking a long Calumet pipe as well. And one of the things to mention is that, of course, Calumet in French is means a reed. Okay, next slide. One of the things when I was starting this, I think this was 2006 when Ruth and others, we made a Grassack trip to Scotland. And at Scotland, this was one of the pipes that we had visited in person. And this is a Calumet pipe stem. And on this, the pipe bowl is actually what we would call in our language manabe, and then others in different dialect would say nabanabe. And that's a mer person, half fish, half human. But the reason I wanted to highlight this or show this at this particular point in the presentation is that this is the only pipe that I've seen so far, other than the Mi'kmaq style pipe bowls, that have this little clasp there, where the pipe bowl would connect with the pipe stem. The long pipe stem there, nowadays you hardly see, in our area anyway, people using these types of long pipe stems anymore. Our pipe stems are usually now from our elbow to the end of our fingertip, instead of from our heart to the end of our fingertip, or longer. This one, of course, has different types of hair on there, some speculated horsehair, but there's also mallard duck hide on there and feathers. Okay, next slide. So you see that what I was going for, each of these pictures here, this is an Oneida fella, and then one that was called a Ganondague, and that one, the Ganondague in the middle, is supposedly a group of people that were east of the Mohawk, but they were still Haudenosaunee people. And then the last one is one that says his protector or his helper is the serpent, and that they associate that with fire. But each of these, you see, there's like a little chain or something connecting from the pipe bowl to the actual stem. And we don't know, of course, what's actually used there, but we have historic examples where it's different types of basswood and or vegetal fiber. And then sometimes it has beads of wampum strung along that. But the part was, I haven't seen too many examples where they have this connection of a clasp connecting to the calumet stem. Okay, next slide. So last summer, I believe it was, I got a chance to go to the Ganondagan Center, State Historical Site. And I was a bit surprised to see this pipe there. It's a calumet pipe, and it's a circular pipe stem. If it were cut in a cross section, it would be a circle, and then inside apparently the whatever type of wood they were choosing for this, it has a soft pith so that if they use just a hard heated wire, they were able to hollow that out. And here it's quill wrapped as well, and then they have these thongs hanging from the side. But I didn't get to talk to Michael Galbin about this pipe a bit more and to find out a bit more of its history. It had just a little write-up of it. But the point that I wanted to make with this, and this kind of dovetails with what Anne was talking about, this idea of creative networks. But I guess what my bigger research has been, what I've been concerned about with for a number of years is this. I like the way Andrew Newman talks about it, as well as Birgit Rasmussen, and they talk about it as mnemonic communities, and that mnemonic communities have to be uh, communities that actually have shared meaning. So here, this pipe, if it is Catlinite bowl, the bowl came all the way from Minnesota over to Upper State New York, and then the wampum sheath beads that end up going the other way, of course, come from the Atlantic coast. So we have this cross networks of material, not only materials, but after a while, this, as what Anne said, this creative network of the use of symbols that get used by many different nations. Okay, next slide. So here, this is again another captain, and this one it's written in Ojibwe what he's saying, and that pipe is kind of floating on your left there. It's floating in air. But he has a little a horn that he uses to summon the people. But how we handle pipes now in our area is Anishinaabe people. We actually would turn them in different directions, and when you hold them, you just point them this way or that. But these pipe stems are so long, it's really unwieldy to turn a pipe like that in that convention. So what used to happen, of course, these are in written accounts, is that they would do this Calumet dance. They would have a dance that would go with this. And because if any of you ever seen a native person, Anishinaabe person, or Shawnee, they'll turn that pipe into the four directions, and then they'll to the sky and to the earth and different places. But they're pointing the mouthpiece to it, inviting all those spirits to take a puff. But here you see depictions of that dance where they're actually holding it, and it looks like it's choreographed, and you have these other the pipe then becomes this symbol of what we would now call diplomatic immunity as well. When you're going in through an area, you're able to use that pipe as a token of peace, and that you are not to be um, um, messed with. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, okay, I thought I froze. So here, this a colleague of mine took the time. I asked him if he could make a little map about where these Catlinite is actually and this is of course the Pipestone National Park in Minnesota. But this is where the Catlinite was coming from, and he called it the Iowa Trail. And here you see that this is where they actually cut across the Great Plains, and then they got back into the forest, and then up to Green Bay area, and then out to Michilimackinac and the Arbor Cross to the Odawa people, then down along to Manitoulin, and then down the shore of Georgian Bay in Canada, what is now called Canada, and then down to Niagara Falls area, and right out to Warren, out in near Onondaga, the heart of Haudenosaunee country. But Anne again mentioned the great distances that people were traveling. And here you see the great distances, not only are people traveling, but also items and materials. So all the way from the Catlin that's coming, that is conceivably coming, the majority of Catlin comes from this area. There are other deposits elsewhere, but this was the main place where it was coming from. So they would go all the way across, and that's how far this material is. I should have done what Anne had done and actually went on Google Maps and see how far this actually is in distance. Okay, next map, please. I mean, slide. So Ruth also mentioned this, and as well as Henrietta, this idea about the not only the curiosity cabinets, but also Sir William Johnson's study or his council room. I actually went there to Johnsonville and went to Johnson Manor. And this is a picture of that, the commander's room in forts where conferences are held and where all the belts which the Indians deliver are hung up. And that room is actually kind of small. I was a bit surprised because when I went in there, I thought I was expecting a bit of a bigger room. But here, what Johnson says to the Mississaugas in 1761, he says, Brethren, the many belts of wampum and calmets of peace which hang in this room convince me of your and of the neighboring nations' good intentions, and the just sense which you all entertain of the blessings arriving from peace and our friendship. So whenever they had these diplomatic interludes, Sir William Johnson in 1760 had sent emissaries up to Green Bay, to Michilimackinac, and to Detroit. And each of them had a speech, and part of the speech was they said that they were commanded by Sir William Johnson on the orders of the king to take a brand and to ignite a fire here after the French had vacated the forts. And with this brand, they said, we'll start this fire that'll burn a brilliant flame that all the nations around will see it and will come to it. So they would do these ceremonies there, but one thing is that as each of these nations came into these areas, they would bring these pipes and they would bring these belts, and they would be deposited in those forts at those council the commanders' rooms or the council rooms. So and then they had a system there where in the room sometimes the pipes were they're like more or less sounds like two nails were in the wall, and then they just put the pipe on the wall. And so if you were able to visualize pipes stacked on the wall, and then there were drawers full of wampum belts. And then Sir William Johnson writes in later correspondence that each of these had a little tag that referred to a folio number, so that he kept track of which nation came and brought in that pipe, and which nation came in and brought that belt, and which of the two go together. Unfortunately, we don't know where all of these went. Okay, next slide, please. Or I should say, I don't know. Here's one of the things. This is a pipe at the bottom. I just like that pipe, but it's at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge. Here, one of the things that like I said, that I'm researching about this shared community and these mnemonic communities is that these are symbols that actually keep getting used over and over, and different nations use these symbols. And it's this hourglass shape, but sometimes the hourglass shape has that intersecting line or bar. But this is the pipe. This is a speech that is likely Pontiac, but that hasn't been confirmed. But he gives this pipe to Sir William Johnson's deputy, George Crone, and he says that all the people around will know that this is our pipe. And then the other explorer, fur trader named Jonathan Carver, who went up into the Lake Superior area, also had visited with the Cree people, Ojibwe people, and Dakota people. And he also noted that when you and he was like Marquette, the Jesuit Marquette, at the prow of his canoe, he erected that calumet pipe to basically visually symbolize that he's on a mission of peace and that he was not to be ambushed. But what these guys say at that time, what is said at that time is that everyone would know whose pipe this is and how it was decorated. And this is the part that I'm trying to research, and this is the part that I actually do not really fully understand yet, is how each of these are seen as at one point in time, different chiefs would have come to a room like Sir William Johnson's room and saw all these pipes, and they would have known which different nations deposited those pipes there. And of course, they talk about hoisting this pipe up for safety. Okay, next slide. The reason I guess I'm more additionally want to research this even more is in a couple of years ago, this pipe was up for auction. And then the chiefs of Manitoulin sprung to action, but particularly the one that took a more vigorous role, a lead role, was Chief Duke Peltry of Wequampcong. And then they were able to stop the sale of this, and the Bondhead family descendants actually ended up saying that they'll remove it from the auction block and that they will allow this to be just sold back to the community. So in partnership with the Canadian government, this was purchased, and then in partnership with the Royal Ontario Museum, this was brought back to that they kind of the Royal Ontario Museum kind of serves as the insurer or the surety of this. Anyway, this pipe has come up to Manitoulin for a number of different gatherings and people, and is stored at the Ojibwe Culture Foundation, where I used to work. But there's different people there now, Naomi Reckley. Anyway, one of the things that I wanted to see is this pipe an Odawa pipe? Is this pipe a Menominee pipe? Is this pipe a Ho-Chunk pipe? Is this pipe a Nipissing pipe? All of these nations came to Manitowoc in 1836. And the assumption right now has been that this is a pipe that was given by Anishinaabe people. And of course, I want to believe that, but I want to confirm it actually. So these are the patterns. There's a bit of hide on there that I don't know what kind of hide that was. The fur is uh, deteriorated to the point that it's fallen off, but the quills are still on there. Okay, next slide. This is the pipe that's at that you probably are seeing. And one of the things with this pipe is I've drawn a lot on the work of Arnie Brownstone, but also on the work of Cassim McLaughlin, who did an excellent book on the Lewis and Clark expedition. But here, this type of pipe, some would call it a puzzle pipe. But when I think of a puzzle pipe, I think of it a bit more elaborate than this kind of two-pronged pipe stem with there. But the interesting thing here, again, this is like a transition piece. Uh, these two, where the two bars are, and it's just more or less flat quill work wrapped around. And then in between the solid parts, you'll see that that's actually quill wrapped thong. And then that thong that's quill wrapped then gets wrapped around. And I'm talking about the middle piece there. So this is these are fascinating works of art. And then again, to talk about what the previous speaker had mentioned about the gender roles, I'm sure that the men crafted the stem from wood. But what I've never seen, or I'm not 100% sure of, is that the men did the quill work, which I highly doubt. So I believe the women would have braided the quills to make that thong, and then wrapped it around to make it those patterns, and then they would have also quill wrapped those. Okay, next slide. So thankfully, I think it was Michael Galvin had sent me, he took a picture of the other side, and here what you see is what would be the bottom of the pipe. And you see there's that seam where each of those quills are fastened together. And I don't really have time to look into that. I mean, to talk about that a bit more. But then you see the two parallel um, um, pipe bowl stems there, that they are also quill wrapped as well. Okay, next slide. So I'm trying to come up with a bit of a diagnostic, and in a sense, it's a bit of a fool's game. There's a bit too much. This was too ubiquitous. Too many different nations used this. Too many nations were influenced by each other. Too many nations swap pipe stems and then swap pipe bowls. So that type pipe stem, the Calumet stem, is actually the Bondhead one. And the reason I keep using that one is because we have a firm date of 1837. Because Bondhead was after the Upper Canada rebellions, he was removed from his office as lieutenant governor. And then under that is another pipe stem, but this is at the Royal Ontario Museum. And kind of the assumption, like one of the elders I used to consult would always talk about colors and color patterns, but he's passed away, so I was never able to ask him about what do this particular pattern of color mean to you. And unfortunately, like I said, we weren't able to get that far. But this one here is a pipe stem, the very bottom one with the deer tail at the mouthpiece, and one wrapped with a bit of a like a little sash kind of thing with beaded works. You see that it's actually a combination as well of that older form. And Castle McLaughlin is the one that says that these rounder reed type stems would hearken to the more ancient practices as well as the ancient pipes. Okay, next one. So here, Lewis and Clark, of course, this is their map going of their trail going out 1804 to 1806. And here, what Castle McLaughlin tried to do was to look at this trail and then to try and find where these pipes came from and to match the pipe with the nation. Okay, next slide. Here are pictures of the pipes, the Calumet pipe stems that are at the Peabody Museum in Cambridge. And here you see that the flat stem pipe stems come from the Iowa, the Winnebago, the Ho-Chunk, the Sauk, Fox, Potawatomi, and Dakota. So next slide, please. So those flat stems that you see here, those are actually like what this one in the Farquharson collection is a flat stem, but it's a combination of the two. So it's a transition piece. So what Castle McLaughlin was able to do with her team was that they looked at the 14 Calumet that are in the collection, and they went through all the correspondence and the multiple times that this was purchased by Peel, and then it was at the Boston Museum, and then they got handed over to, eventually made its way to the Peabody Museum. But again, you see it says the Yankton, the Teton, the Dakota, the Blount, the Winnebago, the Fox. So, and then there's one by SAUX, and so she has a discussion about if that really means the Sioux or if it means the Sauk. Anyway, and then there's only one with the named, no, two chiefs that are named White Skin and White Pigeon. So we have a bit of a tribal origin. We can narrow it down, but there's no real definitive ones. Okay, next slide. So here I put these together. I got to go visit the pipes at the Peabody Museum, uh, and then also the pipes at the National Museum of Natural History. But these ones I put together because they're on the one hand they're the flat stem, and here at your most left you'll see there is one of the flat stemmed, or she calls them ovoid because they're somewhat oval, uh, with that wampum strings tied to it and suspending around it. But you can't really tell in this picture, or maybe you can, but the ones on your left are those quill wrapped thong, and then that thong is wrapped around and round. And here so you see the second from the left, it's kind of slanting, and it's if anybody were brave enough or allowed to do this, I guess if you pulled that more and tightened it up, then that image would become straight again. Anyway, you see on that leftmost pipe stem, those images that of the hourglass, and then the bar in the middle as well again. So this symbol occurs kind of quite uh, over quite a range. So here the three on your right are, this is a Calumet stem, and again this is at the Peabody Museum, and Castle McLaughlin. Her theory is basically that this is the what it would be the oldest pipe stem in there, and one because it's round, and then secondly because of the quill work where it's just this simple one by one going across rather than this quill wrap thong. And then you have this here. This is the other part, is you see that kind of lattice on pattern on the second one, second picture. That's the opposite side of the furthermost left. Anyway, that lattice pattern appears in the Western Great Lakes area quite a bit, and it's this kind of weaving of quills, different colored quills, and then we see that kind of sometimes we'll see that on moccasins and knife sheaths, and of course that headband that's made of the what that's the quill work on the slats of wood. Next slide. So here, back to this particular pipe and its form. I looked at the air collection of photographs, and I did this the other year, and I just pulled out as many different pictures of of people that were photographed with pipes, and of course, in some of these instances, the photographer, especially in Minnesota, I found this, and of course, artists like Catlin and Paul Kane, the Canadian artist Paul Kane, they actually had these props in their studio. They would purchase these things, and then when they would get to do the painting, then they would bring their prop out and say, okay, well, this one will go with this painting here. Or, but photographers did the same thing. They would have this. I still got this pipe, and so in Minnesota area, there's a chief named Kijik, and that means crossing sky. And then he's holding a pipe and he's wearing a blanket. And then a few pictures later, there's a different chief there named Guizes, and he too is wearing the same blanket and he's got that same pipe. So there's a bit of caution in using these things as documentary evidence, but these are often used as documentation or documentary evidence. But here, what you see, what I was able to see with this pipe is it actually the stem follows that same pattern that the Farquharson has there. So it has those two kind of barrels on either side, and then goes solid, and then two barrels and down. So that's why I highlighted that. Although the picture isn't the best, but that you can see that. Okay, next slide, please. So these are delegations pictures that were taken when different delegations went to different cities. Sometimes they went to Philadelphia, sometimes in New York, sometimes to Washington, D.C. But this is a Dakota delegation going to New York City in 1858. And you see that two of them have these long pipe stems, these Calumet pipe stems, but they're flat. And then especially the one that's seated at the leftmost, and you see he has that what some would call a pipe puzzle pipe, but it's a flat stem, and it's got those two rails on either side, and then it's got those two holes on either periodically. Okay, next slide. There's no quill wrapping on it though. That's evident, that I can evidently see. So this is a Chippewa delegation as well. And then these, you see how long that pipe stem is. And then also the one the one seated in the center also has another pipe stem that's quite long. But here they would do these other ones that were twisted. Okay, next slide. Oh, what happened there? And you, yeah, okay, that wasn't how I remembered it. But anyway, so here you see again, this one is a pipe stem. And I didn't get to do research on this. I was doing these photographs of the Bondhead pipe at the Royal Ontario Museum. And then we went to go put it back, and then they opened a drawer, and I saw this pipe stem, and it has again those two rails on either side of that, and it's incised with thunderbirds, and it has these slats with the quill work on there as well. Next slide. So this is a kind of a famous painting, I mean, a photograph, when a delegation, a mixed intertribal delegation went to see and visit President Johnson in 1867, and they took a group photo. And the Ojibwe chief Bogone Gijik is supposedly right in the center, standing on the second level there, um, again leaning against the pillar. But there, of course, hit the next button, please. But when you see that this is actually a multinational delegation, there are Yankton Sioux there, there are Dakota there are Santee, there are Sauk, Fox, Ojibwe, Odawa, Kickapoo, and Miami. And then you see all these different nations holding that kind of pipe. Anyway, part of me wanted to laugh after I'd compiled all this, because I one of the things I keep trying to do is look for and find out is who made that pipe and who gave that pipe, and in the Farquharson collection, and trying to look at it in a kind of diagnostic fashion to see which people did it come from. And at this point, I can't answer that. Okay, next slide. As we know, what I tried to show there then is that especially when people are going down in the Ohio area in the 1700s, there's just a multitude of nations there. And then, of course, we know later on in the 1790s that St. Clair's army is defeated. And then you have the Battle of Fallen Timbers and then the Treaty of Grenville. And there's just multinational communities living together at the Oglays and stuff. So there's this um, cross-fertilization of ideas as well as of diplomatic symbols as well as of diplomatic materials. And there's a fascinating, if any of you are ever interested, just read the council minutes of the Treaty of Grenville, if you ever are interested in that. It's in the APSI. I forget what that stands for, American, I forget what the P stands for. Anyway, it just talks about all these different nations, their speeches that they gave and delivered, and how they situated themselves as kinship. And the one thing that I'll share here is that the Shawnee ended up saying, I am the younger brother here. I started out here as the younger brother, but you see me come and take my seat here at the front as an elder brother. And then whoever was taking the note said that the Shawnee are recognized as a younger nation. The Delaware and the Munsee are seen as grandfathers. The Wendat are seen as the uncles, and then the Ojibwe and Odawa fight amongst each other of who's the elder brother. But all three agree that the Potawatomi are younger than them, as well as the Shawnee. But here in this fictive kinship network, the Shawnee made a kind of what we would now call a political power play. And that's when they took their seat up at the front and said that we are now viewing ourselves as elder brothers. Anyway, then you see all this different diplomatic language that goes along with passing the pipes and then passing the wampum strings and the wampum belts and running their hands through those wampum strings. And then of course this diffuses throughout the Great Lakes, and it had already diffused before then, but it's actually this contraction of migration and then this diffusion when of course displacement occurs as well. So I think that's all I wanted to say at this point. And again, I want to thank the organizers for providing us the opportunity to do this through Zoom and saving some travel time and as well as potential delay at the border. But thank you again for inviting me.
So feel free to grab some snacks, beverages. I think we probably could field 1 or 2 questions. And if you wouldn't mind specifying the speaker that the question is for, that would save us a little scramble time to find the right answer.
Any questions? Oh.
I have a question for Alan. You had stated that in the past that the stems of the pipes would go from the heart to the fingertips, and that more recently they're shorter. Is there a reason for this shift?
I don't know the answer to that, why that ended up happening and how that ended up happening, but pipe stems are about this long now. And people, maybe it was just being wieldy or I don't know. But these calumet, some say that the calumet stems were for more elaborate ceremonies and treaties, and then the smaller ones weren't. But that's something that's still debated, and I haven't found any definitive answers yet.
I'll just toss this out. I've got a little observation. This Farquharson collection went up for auction. How did one object at a time? How could someone talk about how it managed to stay all together and then make its way here?
I can probably answer that question. We were given the opportunity to acquire it as a whole collection in 2023, but prior to that, it was in a private collection in New York. So when the Farquharson estate decided to sell off the collection, they also went through Sotheby's with the intent that they would auction off piece by piece rather than as a whole. But to our great good fortune, the individual that purchased it as a private collector bid on every single object with the intent that it stay together as a collection. So when he passed, his estate wanted to approach institutions to maintain the integrity of the collection rather than auction it off piecemeal.
I want to congratulate everyone for your amazing talks. And I think it was Christian who said, you know, it's a small exhibition, it's one gallery. But I think the fact that these talks went on for about 2 hours, but we could have listened to you all day, speaks to the universe that is in that one room, or the worlds and the circuitousness and exchange and diplomacy. For example, Henrietta, I really appreciated you bringing us to think about the Scottish context, particularly in British imperialism. And Annette and Christian, as well as Ruth, just thinking particularly about gender and women's roles. And then Alan, you talking about these sort of family networks and this language of father and brother. So many different things to pull out in these conversations. So I just want to congratulate you all and just say, as a scholar of the 18th century, I was just enthralled, and I wish I could do this every day. As an administrator, I really can't. That's not my job anymore, but thank you for taking me to school today. I loved it. But I thought I'd ask Christian a question, which, you know, you started out by saying you're not an art historian, but from personal experience, I sometimes think you out art historian the art historians. So I wanted to ask you if you particularly chose to focus on the works of 3 Indigenous women artists, and what continuities you see, particularly in the work of women, probably building on the conversation that Annette presented to us about women working across different networks.
Thank you for that. That was very kind. I mean, I think Annette really laid the groundwork with this. I should also say, Ruth and Alan's scholarship has also really informed a lot of this. This notion that I think the focus on women is because the archival records tend to obfuscate the role of women in Anglo-American record keeping. So in French record keeping too, one of the things that you'll see is that women are referred to obliquely or on the side, even though there are clearly these patronage networks that are taking place among European women as well. And so I think it's really striking to see the ways in which the material evidence actually makes very clear the central presence of women in maintaining, expanding, evolving, and developing these kinds of networks. And you see it in the 18th century, but you see it also continuing to today. One, I think that speaks to a kind of unbroken passing of knowledge and tradition and experience from one generation to the next. But it's also that reminder, I was trained as a classic historian of the early modern Atlantic world. Most of the sources that I had access to were used by men, collected by men, and stewarded by men. And so it's been a really interesting and important reminder of being able to recover certain voices or to learn from Indigenous communities that have made very clear that those voices don't need to be recovered. They've been there all along. So it's really about showcasing a kind of practice.
It's coming on. Sorry. It's actually, if you think what's happening is men are sending this stuff to women, and that happens, in the 19th century as well. And the women are curating it. So there's a sort of weird acknowledgement of informal power. So as James Foxton is sending it to Lady Sinclair, who he's related to in a strange way, he may be sort of honoring her interests, but in a sense, she's the one that's curating it into the future. And you see that in other moments of this sort of intercultural transfer of items. So it is interesting how they're consciously sort of caretaking and stewarding that material into the future. So the men may be the collectors, but the women are the curators, as it were. Yeah. So I don't know whether either Anne or Ruth would wish to think or comment on that.
Ruth, please go ahead.
Just thank you, everybody, for the wonderful, fascinating papers. I'm still absorbing them myself. But in terms of this issue of women, I just thought I'd share with you that when Isabella Grant wrote her will, her husband died soon after they returned to Ireland, sadly. She lived quite a while longer, and she left in her will, "My Indian cabinet and the jewels of my body," to her daughter. And she had sons, and in fact, eventually it was the husband of the daughter who gave this collection to the National Museum of Ireland. But I've always been so struck by that phrase, "my Indian cabinet and the jewels of my body," because it just seems to make it so personal. The other thing I would add is that European women were great needlewomen, especially aristocratic women. They were embroiderers, and they did all kinds of handicrafts, that we would call them, at quite a high level often. And they were very interested in the work done by women in other parts of the world that went on right through the awful days of the High Empire. Their power relations certainly altered and became very oppressive, but this interest and admiration is some kind of counter flow that goes on throughout this period of collecting. And I do think that I'd really like to know more about the Lady Sinclair, because and also, I kept coming across these tantalizing little things that Joseph Bloomfield's wife voted, as did a number of women of her acquaintance, in around elections in around 1803 and 1804 in New Jersey, as I recall. And is there a Museum of the American Revolution in Pennsylvania? I came across this tidbit in an online exhibition that they had done about women. And I had really not been aware of this sort of earliness of the suffrage movement amongst women, but it just it seems to me we have to try to make distinctions amongst different kinds of collectors as well. There are broad patterns, but then there are also individuals who may be more or less open to learning from other cultures, as today.
Any other questions?
Hello, this is for Dr. Allen. Allen. This is a question about the calumet pipes. Does the name derive from a stone or a place? How does it get this name?
Apparently, that's a French word for reed.
For
Calumet.
reed.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
And so once the French, of course, were inland further earlier, they ended up calling it that. And then I guess the British and others accepted that word.
Okay. The other question I had were about those really long pipe stems. On the ends, it doesn't look like a typical pipe like you would inhale on. And it looks like it would actually compartmentalize into another piece. And forgive me if you've already answered that, but were those super long pipes made that way to pull apart and put back together? Was that ever a thing?
I don't know if I've never heard of that them being pulled apart per se. Like, I'm not sure if you mean the pipe bowl from the pipe stem, but the stem itself, the whole length of it was not disassembled. But there is some that actually these puzzle pipes apparently they did slice and then carve um, a groove in it so that the smoke would have a way to get through the length of the pipe, and then they would put those two back together. And I think it was Arnie Brownstone's article that had an X-ray of that puzzle pipe, but it might have also been in Castle McLaughlin's. I'm just misremembering which one had actually taken an X-ray of that long pipe stem, flat pipe stem, and it has holes in it, and it's this what they call a puzzle stem, but the actual line where the smoke would go kind of meanders through the stem. So it looks like it's a trick, but it's actually apparently was sliced in half, and then they made this groove, and then they put it back together. If that's what you mean, but I don't know of any of them coming apart like I don't know those old when you used to have a ruler that would come out like multiple times. It wasn't like anything like that. But the bowl definitely was detached from that.
Thank you, everybody. I wanted to add just a nice little sort of wrap up that when we had the opening reception, we had 3 members of the Farquharson family, the U.S. clan, arrive. And one young woman, Amelia Farquharson, is Lady Sinclair, is her namesake. So it was a nice kind of tie-in, and she got to see these objects that were descended from a direct family member. So yeah, that's it. And I really appreciate you guys spending your Saturday with us. Go see the exhibition.